Good afternoon, everybody.
Hello, Mavis.
Hi, Vern.
Hello.
Hello, Cheryl. Hi, Michelle. Hi, Deb. Hi, Anita.
Good afternoon.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon.
Howdy.
Hi.
Hello, birthday girl.
Haha. Thanks, Deb.
You bet. Mavis, thank you for being the official greeter. It's very thoughtful.
Well, you're welcome, Deborah. So, who can tell me what revenues and net expenditures mean? That means expenses minus revenues, correct? I'm just asking before the meeting starts. I'll ask later. I think I figured it out.
Bye, hon. See you there.
Mavis, you're wearing Republican colors.
And my pigtails.
I thought all the Republican colors now were black.
Oh,
No, that's the,
I'm just gonna laugh.
I'm just going to say, I think that Mavis's pigtails are adorable. She looks like a teenager again.
I'll second that, though I never knew Mavis as a teenager.
it keeps my neck cool.
Is this supposed to be a long meeting? Anybody know? I've got to go to a food drive at 4.
I don't know. Where's the food drive?
St. Therese.
You've been to other ones of those, right? Are there-
Yeah, I pretty much commit to Tuesdays. So, I mean, there's a lot of them right now, but it's on my calendar. I told them I would be there.
My guess would be, since it's starting at 3, it's going to be a long one. But occasionally, I'm
Fantastic.
surprised. Now, budget meetings are always long.
I know.
I told my family 5 o'clock, but I don't know. I could be,
Oh, dear.
I could be wrong. I was wrong once.
Well, if we're not voting on anything, I may have to go back and listen to the end of it so I can get over there on time. So, feeding the hungry. Sorry, guys. Priority. I said hungry, and my dog looked at me. Just FYI.
Yeah, there's been a lot of food drives, and still not enough.
Nope, still not enough. I think we're going with
What
over
kind
300 people.
What kind of food drive is it?
Hello, everybody. The audio is on, and I'd like to welcome you all to Kane County's Special Committee of the Whole meeting on Tuesday, August 30th, 2022. Clerk, please call the roll.
Allen,
Alan, present. Good afternoon.
Bates,
Bates here.
Berman, Brown,
Brown here.
Davist, Ford, Braz, Gums,
Gums here.
Iqbal, Kenyon,
Here, present in the room.
Caius,
Caius present.
Gopi, Leonard, Lewis,
Lewis here.
Martin,
Martin present.
Molina, Sanchez, Shepro, Silva,
Who's here?
Strathman,
Strathman here.
Sturgis,
Purchase here.
Tepe,
Jeffy here.
Wallace,
Here.
Woniggy, Pirog.
Here. Okay, so we have Ford, Berman, Davos, Traz, Iqbal, Kobe, Leonard, Molina, Sanchez. Ken, Shepro's right there.
Mr. Shepro,
Somehow I hit the mute button, which is unusual for me. I'm here.
Yeah, it is.
1, 2, 3, 4,
Oh, there's the top of his head anyway.
showing 13.
So we have a quorum? Okay.
What is the number?
13 are present.
It's a
Don
quorum.
Wolf used to call this the committee of the half.
Committee of the half of a whole. All right, no one can leave. Lock the doors.
Is that 13 board members plus the chair?
Yes.
Then one person can leave.
Bye.
Already scored that.
So goes to
Goodbye.
chair. I'm out of here.
Goodbye, Michelle.
That was me.
I'll be here for a while.
All
I'll
right,
be here for a
everybody,
while.
hold on to your hats. It's going to be an interesting presentation. All right.
May I ask, Madam Chair, Shepro,
Yes, Mr. Shepherd, absolutely.
what, I mean, the poor attendance would suggest something connected with the speed with which this meeting is called and the lack of information beforehand. I guess I would just say that if this is really an important meeting with important information, it seems as if we could have given a little bit more notice of it.
I believe that was properly noticed. It was a week.
Well, you'd have to go to your email to see that.
I looked at that. Regardless, last week of August, I really don't believe that the 11 absent members are simply being derelict in their duty. We weren't given any detail as far as I could tell, and I checked my email. There's no agenda packet.
It's
I
the
just-
information, it's because it's committee of the whole, it's just information. I believe this was sent out, the report was sent out. Was it later, was it today? Or was it yesterday that the, Mr. Onsick was today?
We got it today, yes.
Partly before the meeting, so we do have
What
that
time
information.
what time was it
One-
sent out?
1:20 PM.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I made the mistake of checking at 1 PM thinking nobody would really send it out
And
less than 2 hours before the meeting.
And I have to, we could have delayed this, but we have a lot to discuss, a lot to think about, and,
Is
your
it your
comments
intention
your
to,
comments are received.
are
But
you
I,
intending, well, I have a motion. I'd like to move to adjourn the meeting.
Don't recognize it. You don't have to recognize it.
Well,
Time to Push mute, Ken.
if we're going to have a discussion, a serious discussion about something we got 2 hours before the meeting, this is not the first time that the board has suggested that it doesn't appreciate that.
Point of order, is there a motion on the floor?
I move to adjourn. Yes, there's no second. I'll withdraw the motion. I'll
Thank you,
withdraw
sir.
the motion.
all right, let's begin. Let's begin. We have a pledge of allegiance, which is something we do have to do. So, Mr. Caius, could you please lead us?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United
United States of America.
and to the republic for which it stands,
for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We are now,
God,
Mr.
Look at
Iqbal,
this.
welcome.
Fiscal, too.
Can I have a motion and a second now to approve the minutes of will be deferred. I've read my notes, my apologies, will be deferred to the next committee of the whole meeting. Is there any public comment? I don't see anybody in the audience and I don't see anybody online. So the reason for the meeting, please, Mr. Honzik.
Good afternoon, everyone.
And Joe, you're welcome to sit if you would prefer that, if it'd be more comfortable for you.
Thank you. I may do that, but I'll start by standing.
Okay,
Thank you. Okay. I assume you have the PowerPoint that you can display. That's okay.
May we interrupt with questions, Madam Chair?
Oh, my God.
Oh, well, we can't even, a question, we can't talk about the budget. We haven't seen it, but if it's, yes. No,
Okay.
this, oh, no, I would prefer we go through it. And then perhaps, Joe, after you go through a chapter, as you guide us through this, we can open it up to questions at that point when you're done with one section.
Okay. Wherever there's a natural stopping point, you're welcome to interrupt me. I may not notice that it's a time for questions. So, because it really is a complete package. It flows from beginning to end, but I could stop at any time. And I apologize that it took until less than 2 hours before the meeting. It wasn't possible for me to get it done any sooner with the number of hours there are in a day. And I wanted to make sure that I could fit in every possible piece of information that I could that would help you to make sense of it and to pull it apart and to do the analysis so that it would make more sense. But okay, so here we go. This is the first page, and I hope you're able to pull it up also on your computers in case the font is too small to see it on the screen, but I think this might be good enough to see. So this is it. This is the proposed fiscal year 2023 general fund budget as of today. And I just wanted to note that there is a 3% non-union increase built in to this version of the budget. And there's also $700,000 department equity adjustment that had been arrived at by the Human Resource Department several weeks ago and has been included in my forecasts. So I wanted to make sure to include that in the budget, but of course that could change. But those are the two key things that are included that I wanted you to understand when we look at this. So if you look at the 2023 budget column, you'll see that our revenues are 106 million, and expenditures are almost 122 million, which leaves a deficit of 15.8 million. I compare it to the 2022 budget by having pulled out our use of reserves to balance that budget. So we had used up so far in the amended version of the budget, $13.2 million of reserves to balance the 2022 balance budget. And now we have a deficit of $15.8 million that needs to be covered in the 2023 budget. This is an increase in the deficit of $2.6 million from year to year. And I also just wanted to note that since it has not been determined by the board yet in terms of what amount of increase should be provided for non-union employees, I'm also indicating at the bottom of this slide that each 1% of an increase for non-union employees equates to $370,000. So if you were to increase it to 4%, as had been part of the original forecast, it would increase the use of reserves by that amount, which would bring the total needed reserves up to 16.1 million. And I also wanted to note, according to the information we have, and hopefully someone can correct me or us if I'm wrong, it looks like the judiciary has already included a 4% increase for their non-union people, merit commission of 5%, and the treasurer's office 5%. So when factoring in the increases for the non-union, I excluded those departments since they already have increases built in. Okay, now this slide, it's more columns, so the figures are smaller, but I wanted to try to break out for you the major portions of what's impacting the budget. So we start in the first column with the fiscal year 22 budget, but I pulled out of that budget the Safety Act expenses that have already been approved as part of the FY22 budget, so that I can then have in the next column the total of cost of all of the Safety Act expenses that are impacting the FY23 budget. So that would include the ones that have already been added in FY22, plus the ones that are about to be added in FY23. So that total cost is almost $3.4 million. There's also almost $2.5 million worth of new positions that have been added to the FY23 budget. There has been an overall decrease of almost $5 million, and that has to do with increases in revenues from one year to the next, primarily. So the net change, even though there's, well, maybe I should look at revenues and expenses separately in that other column. So revenues have increased almost $15 million and expenses have increased almost $10 million. So the difference there is about $5 million, where we're $5 million ahead because we increased revenue more than the expenses. Then I have the cost of the 3% non-union increase, which is the 1.1 million. And then we have the cost of the $700,000 equity adjustment, which when you include FICA and IMRF is $700 and roughly $90,000. So all of those major changes between revenues and expenditures is what leads to the $15.8 million deficit.
No question.
Yeah.
Serge is here. On the equity column adjustment,
Yes.
is that, and please, these are questions and I don't know, is that year one of a 3-year plan?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
That's the first year. And the reason why you see those negative numbers in revenues when you're talking about Safety Act expenses, new positions, the non-union increase and the equity adjustment, it's because those increases on the expense line have associated increases with IMRF and FICA. And when IMRF and FICA expense is located in a different fund, because that fund needs an increased amount of property, those two funds need an increased amount of property tax revenue. That increased amount of property tax revenue has to come out of the general fund, which is why you're showing a decrease of revenue. It's a decrease of property tax revenue that's going into the IMRF and FICA funds to help pay for the associated expenses, IMRF and FICA expenses with these wage increases. So that's why it looks a little bit strange. But if you look at the total red line use of reserves, you can see that that's the true cost of those increases.
And one other question.
Yeah.
On the last screen where you showed 1 year compared to the next year, which was probably the same 2 columns. Yes. Last year, we had budgeted to pull monies from reserves.
Yes.
But then I believe, and I just want to make sure I'm right, we ultimately showed more revenue coming in and we were able to offset. And so we did not use those reserves. Am I even remotely accurate on that?
Well, okay, maybe we're,
Might be talking apples and oranges,
well,
sorry.
possibly, but I just want to make sure. So in 2021, we did budget the use of reserves and we were able to put them back. In 2022, this is the budget column now, so that's the year we're currently in. We budgeted so far $13 million of reserves to apply to the budget. But again, this year so far, it's looking like sales tax revenues and those other revenues are far exceeding what we had budgeted. And so even though the budget is showing a $13 million deficit, if you look at the forecast, that deficit is just about disappeared, right?
But however, going into 2023,
Yes.
in 21 and 22, in my mind, those are all things remaining equal. We're not remaining equal going into 23. We have some structural changes that are affecting this. Is that a fair, between the Safety Act, the equity adjustments and stuff?
Yes,
There are other pressures there that,
that's correct.
okay.
As if I may, then yes, sir. As well as commodities and energy costs have escalated this year greatly. Mr. Martin.
So we had $7 million more collected last year than we had
John,
budgeted for.
John, could you please?
We collected in 21, we balanced at the end of the year. By all appearances, we're going to balance at 22 at the end of the year. And my question, if it's been explained or stated, I apologize in advance. Do the numbers that we're dealing with projecting what our budget shortfall is going to be next year reflect the fact that we don't really have we're not really using reserves this year? Do we reflect the higher rate of income because we started with a distorted low because of the pandemic and then recovered? And I don't know that in our planning, we ever assume that that money is going to still be there. Are we doing that as we project what our budgetary issues are going to be next year? Are we saying our income is going to be up to where it's going to be this year? Because we don't have any anticipation of it being lower, do we?
No. So you're correct in that we did not factor in the increase in the FY22 budget, which is why we thought we needed to use that $13 million of
But
reserves.
if we didn't do it for 22,
Yes.
then isn't 13, isn't 23? It builds in that, it builds in the non-inclusion. I don't know how you build in a negative, but if we didn't include it, we're saying we've
It's a
drawn on
reserve, dummy.
we say we've drawn on reserves, but we haven't.
No, we haven't. We have not.
Who is that?
Berman,
We've drawn on reserves, but we have excess money coming in. So we're going to break even this year and not with any significance be drawing on reserves. My question is, are the real numbers that we're going to deal with for 22 reflected in the 23 budget?
Yes, they are reflected.
Mr. Berman, did you have a comment that you would like to make, please? Dale, are you there?
Talk that up to it. Oops.
Okay.
Okay. I'll try to continue then.
oh,
So-
excuse me, Bates, please.
Yes, Ms. Bates.
Okay, since nobody's supposed to ask questions, but everybody is, I would like to ask a question. So who was it? Mr. Martin just said that 2022 will be balanced. Does that mean we're going to pay back those reserves of $13 million? I don't understand that.
Or not draw from them.
It appears that we will. Of course, this is only August, so something could change. But yes, at the current rate, it looks like we will not need to use as much of the reserve in terms of revenue, and probably there'll be enough savings in expenditures to make up whatever use of remaining reserves there were that was not made up by increased revenue. So yes, I anticipate that we will not need to use all of the reserves and that we'll be able to return them at the end of the year.
But we will be using the 16 million for 2023, as far as you can tell.
As far as we can tell. And so if we look at this slide, do you see in the change column, you see how revenue in the general fund is budgeted to be almost $14 million more
Okay.
in 2023. That is an indication that yes, in fact, we are including in the FY23 budget the expectation that we have recovered, and we are trying to base our revenue budget on what we're actually experiencing in 2022. So the fact that there is still a $15 million or almost $16 million deficit is not because we're under budgeting for revenue. I think the budget for revenue is fairly close to what it will be. Now, I should tell you, the Illinois Municipal League is budgeting or is forecasting less revenue than what I am using here, but they have been wrong the past 2 years. So I decided that instead of listening to them and following their forecast, I would look at our own experience, and that is what I used in factoring in the revenue budget for 2023.
Okay,
So
thank you.
I think, it's as good as I could possibly get it at this point. All right.
Joe, I have one
Yes.
question. We had spoken about that previously. The Veteran Affairs Commission, it is my understanding that they can take 2%, 0.2% of the county's total equalized assessed property value, up to no more than, and we must accommodate them. So that, just a clarification, that is reduced from our total property tax levy.
Are you asking me the question?
Yes, I am asking.
I'm sorry, I do not have the answer. I'm waiting for the state's attorney to provide me with their opinion. So I do not know.
I believe my understanding is that's what potentially could happen. So we may have less revenue coming in from the property tax line, budget line, than we had anticipated, because some of that would have to go to the Veterans Affairs Commission.
I think I read a article on that effect.
We will be getting more information on that. Yes.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I just want to make sure that we throw a caveat on that amount is, in my opinion, a very minor amount. And that Jake is only, at the department head, is only asking for the equity portion of those raises, which is minutia compared to what their ask could be.
Oh, I know.
They are not asking for anywhere near that from my understanding. So
No,
I don't want to cast them in a negative light. They're
No
really
one-
being responsible.
No one is being vilified about anything. This is
Thank you.
just, as we're talking about the Safety Act and its requirements, this is another unfunded mandate that the county
Agreed.
has to address. Yes, Mr. Iqbal.
Mr. Onzak, I have a few questions. Number one, you mentioned the non-union raise is incorporated at 4%. Is there a basis for that? Is it to match the union raises, or is it something that you figured is fair and equitable?
It's 3%.
No, please, there's a question on the floor.
The increase that's factored into the budget is 3%. It could be the different unions, different offices have factored in different rates of increases. So 3% was just a suggested. I'm not going to say by who, but it was suggested. So I used that in the budget. 4% was also suggested at one point. And that's what I was using in my forecast. So because I used 4% in the forecast and 3% in the budget, I just wanted to indicate on this slide what the difference is, which is the 370,000. And really the board needs to determine or provide direction as far as whether it's 3, 4, or even 2 or less or not, no increase. But this is what I used based on what was suggested to
Okay.
me.
Good.
Mo, if I can.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Sir, just, I believe we've, and John Martin, you might be able to answer this. I believe we've always tried to match the aggregate of the union wages to the non-union. And I could be wrong on that, but if there's 15 different unions, whatever their aggregate increase was, if it wound up being 3.2%, we've always tried to at least mimic that. Am I mistaken at all?
No, you're correct. This year, it's not possible to do that, in my opinion. I mean, just simply on a pure mathematical basis, because, and hopefully the board is aware of what the large percentages that were approved. They were done as, I guess you would say, equity adjustments. So there were, which resulted in large percentage increases, but there were large percentage increases because we're talking about people on the lower end of the scale. And so when you add a few more $1,000s to their wages, it looks like a large percentage increase, and it is relative to what they were earning. So there were several situations where there were large percentage increases because of those equity adjustments. There were increases to base pay, whatever. So, you know, to try to compare against that is very difficult. There were some unions that got 4%. There were some unions that got 2%. There were some that got 3%. So in addition to the equity increases. So it's
well done and thank you. Sorry.
I think, yeah, that was the question. I'll follow up now. The second thing you mentioned was the Safety Act expenses. They are also included in the expense figure. Is that true?
In the total budget?
Yeah, and the expenses that you
Sorry.
mentioned.
Yes, so I have the Safety Act expenses pulled out in a separate column, and that's almost $3.4 million of expense. But that includes the positions that were already approved in 2022, plus the new ones that will be approved in 2023. And further on, I have a breakout of the two. And since I put this together, I think a few minutes before this was sent out, I was told that what was identified as Safety Act expenses may not necessarily all be Safety Act expenses. So that total may be revised, but this is what I had to work with at the time I put this together.
Now, during the Safety Act presentation, there were several figures mentioned from the state attorney's office, from chief judge's perspective and so forth. Did you include all of them, or did you make your own assessment?
I included everything that they put into their budgets. And then there's a detail coming up, a slide showing you what all the positions are and what departments they're in. So you can see, and you know, if there's somehow a position that really isn't Safety Act, hopefully that will be identified and we can revise it. But as I said, I'm working with the information that's currently been entered into the budget system. So hopefully it's fairly accurate.
So would it be accurate on my part to think that the total expense due to Safety Act would be $3.5 million?
Roughly, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
3.4, I think, yeah,
3.4.
3.4, sorry.
roughly.
Okay, I'm happy to stay on this slide, but I can move forward to get a little ahead, and then it may answer some of your questions, but I can always come back to this as I think this is a good summary. Okay, so what I've done here is then take that same information that we saw in the previous slide where there was one line item for revenue, and I just broke it out by department so that you can see what changes there were in revenue by department. Now you can see on that very top line where it says general revenue, that includes property tax revenue, sales tax revenue, income tax revenue. Those are those major ones. And you can see in that other column how we're forecasting an increase of almost $16 million in those items, those revenue items. So that's where you can really see how we're taking into account the increase in sales tax revenue, income tax revenue, personal property tax revenue, local use tax revenue that we've been experiencing and is now built into the budget. So that's why that is such a large number. You can also see on the circuit clerk line that decrease of almost $1.5 million from last year's budget to this 2022 budget to next year's budget. And that's a reflection of the circuit court fees collection that'll be reduced. And you see reductions in the sheriff's area, state's attorney's area, and in several of the areas. The only area where you see increases would be court services and their reimbursement revenue that they receive, and the recorder was factoring in more due to real estate transactions. So that comes down to the same total increase, or I should say the same total budget of 106 million. So we've gone from 92 million in 2022 to 106 million in 2023. And now this is the expense side, and it's broken out by all those different same columns, the Safety Act, new positions, other changes, which anything other than Safety Act, new positions, non-union increase or equity adjustment. So this is by department. So you can see here where the Safety Act expenses are. It's in some in court services, mostly in state's attorney, some in circuit clerk, and some in public defender. There's new positions in several of these departments and offices. I show the allocation of the non-union 3% increase by department. And then there's nothing in the department equity adjustment column for any specific department because it's all sitting in a contingency. If I go further, you can see it's in the contingency line so that once the project is completed of determining where those adjustments should be and by position, department by department, then we can allocate out from this line item to the specific departments as part of a budget adjustment next year. So right now for the 2023 budget, it's on its own line item. Okay, then this is another look at the revenues by classification. So you can kind of see where the changes are occurring by the classification of revenue. So other taxes would be those sales taxes, local use tax, the RTA sales tax, income tax. Those taxes have an increase of almost $14.5 million. The property tax revenue will increase to the general fund by almost $1 million. It's not because we're raising property taxes. 500,000 of it has to do with new construction. So there is that increase in revenue as a result of that. But the other $462,000 worth is just because we'll be getting more of a share from the IMRF fund than we had last year. And the reason for that is because the rate for IMRF had been reduced for 2023. So there's less expense in the IMRF fund, which frees up more property tax revenue, which can then be shifted over to the general fund. So that's why, although it looks like there's an increase in property tax, it's just the share to the general fund is increased, plus the increase for new construction. Okay, then you have the increase in interest revenue. Last year it was 0.4%. We're budgeting 1% per the treasurer's forecast. Then you see licenses and permit revenues up a smaller amount. And then you see the other changes and several decreases as you go towards the bottom in fines, reimbursements, transfers, and charges for services. And then we see a similar slide by classification for expenses. So you can see the change that's due to salaries and wages. That's up by 7 million. And that again has to do with Safety Act, new positions, the 3% increase, the equity adjustment, all of that factors into that 10% increase. Contractual services is up by 32%. Commodities, 35%, employee benefits, 9%. That has to do with the increase in health insurance rates, but also the increases for the new positions for Safety Act, for example. That services line, I know it's a hard one to understand sometimes, but last year we just generically took $1 million out of the sheriff's budget, out of the whole group of services line items, that it was up to him to allocate how what line item he'd deduct the $1 million from. We're not doing that in the 2023 budget. So because we're not reducing anything by $1 million, it shows up as $1 million increase. So I think I'll move on from here. Okay. Just trying to remember, I don't want to repeat myself here if there's any, this is just another view by department. I think what I'm doing now is just trying to present to you what I've done in the past, where you can look at revenues and expenditures department by department, just in comparison from the total from 2022, the total to 2023 without any other distractions. So you can see that the total revenue increased by $13.8 million. And then we have it department by department where you could see how the expenses changed, and it's in descending order of change. Just another view. You can go back and look at this if you like to see where the sources of the largest increases or decreases are. And then this is another view. A few slides before we had just the revenues, then we showed just the expenses. Well, this is the revenue minus expenses to see how each department contributes to the deficit that's created because of the difference between their revenues and their expenses. You could see most departments contribute to the deficit, but there's some savings in human resources, there's some savings in debt service, some savings in county board as a result of more liquor license revenue, I believe. There's an increase in or savings in the contingency. Last year we budgeted, we tried putting the budget for new positions in the contingency fund last year. This year, we're not doing that. We're just leaving it within the department since that really wasn't worth the effort. It really didn't accomplish anything other than make it more confusing. The recorder always comes out ahead in terms of they generate more revenue than they have expenses. So that's why they're on the positive side. And of course, you see the increase in general government revenue again on its own line item here. Oh, I should back up here just so I could. So the bottom line then is, again, in the 2022 budget, you can see where we had budgeted a $13 million deficit. Then in 2023, we're budgeting almost a $16 million deficit. And so the change there is that $2.6 million increase. Okay, so here's the list of Safety Act positions that were added in FY22. and these were added to the state's attorney's office. It's possible that there is, I understand there might be a position on here or two that really aren't Safety Act. We're in the process of finding that out, but this is what I had at the time. And then here's the detail. It's a few slides of detail of all the positions that are being added in FY23 for Safety Act. So you can see several are in the circuit clerk, several in state's attorney, more in state's attorney, public defender, court services, psychologists, and probation officers. So there you have the subtotal of just the personnel expense, but then there's also, as you can see, some miscellaneous expenses that are related to the personnel, such as additional membership fees, contractual expenditures, employee training, software, hardware, office equipment. So if you add in all of those, it's a total of almost $2.8 million being added in 2023 alone. Now, these are new positions that have nothing to do with the Safety Act. I am wondering if these really are new because there are so many. And so that just, I would like for these departments to help us go back and look at these to make sure these really are new and are being identified as such. And new meaning these are new positions added to the budget that did not exist before, not simply name changes from one position to another. So, but as it stands in the budget right now, it's all of these positions are brand new. So there's several for IT, building management, judiciary, state's attorney's office, court services, the coroner, and development. And development is where we have those property code enforcement expenses. And then there's also additional personnel in the insurance liability fund from the state's attorney's office. I'm showing this here as part of the general fund presentation because any increase in expense in the insurance liability fund requires more property tax revenue to fund those expenses, which then of course means the general fund gets less property tax revenue. So the impact on the general fund by increasing expenses in the insurance liability fund, as we see here, is to reduce the amount of property tax revenue to the general fund, which increases the deficit in the general fund. Okay. And then what this last one of these last slides I wanted to show you was that top line is what in the last forecast that I had prepared for you, we were showing the projected operating shortfall. So for 2022 it was almost $1 million. For 2023 it was 14.1, but the actual budget shortfall that we're now seeing is almost $1.7 million more than what we had projected. And I think it has to do with more of those new positions being added to the budget that have nothing to do with Safety Act that really weren't on our radar screen. So I think that's why it's more. And there's also an increase in revenue more than I had anticipated, which helps to offset it. So, but that's the difference between what we had been forecasting. So unfortunately, it's worse than what we forecasted by almost 1.7 million, which means we need that much more in reserves. Speaking of which, we have 6.6 million in the property tax fees protection fund and almost 22 million in the COVID payroll reimbursement fund. And this is after putting back the reserves that we probably aren't going to need in FY22. So we're left with about $29 million worth, or we will be left with about $29 million worth at the end of the year. Plus, you know, certainly more can be added to it if we have more savings, like in where you compare what we budgeted for expenses this year to what the actual expenses were. Any savings there could also be added to this. But at a minimum, I would expect $29 million. We're going, if there's if nothing changes, if we're not going to increase revenue, if we're not going to cut expenses, then we would need to use almost $15.8 million to balance the budget, which would leave us with $13 million in reserves. And then again, if you were to increase the non-union wages by an additional percent like we had in the forecast, that would be another 370,000 that would be reduced from the reserve balance. And then this is where we would touch on what's happening with the Veterans Commission. They need $156,000 to balance their budget. It doesn't look like we'll be increasing property tax revenue this year. So this $156,000 would need to come out of the reserves probably. So I have that there just to make you aware of the impact on the reserve balance, even though it has nothing to do with the general fund itself. And this is, oh, I'm sorry, is there questions?
Yes, sir.
Wallace, I'm just wondering if you can go back to slide number 18. This is under the new non-safety act positions added. And I'm wondering if I'm reading this wrong. The next slide, I'm sorry. So a network administrator, 99,740 plus FICA and IMRF, 8,321, but the total 207,801.
You're right. That's an error in the in this column total. I'm sorry. I was trying to do this right before I left, and
So if we go to the next page,
yeah,
I want to make sure that our numbers are correct. So we have the total of
Another one here too.
new non-safety acquisitions, 4.7 million. It's actually not that. It's 2 point something, 2.4. 2.5 million.
If we go back to the beginning, I'm sorry, I was so afraid there was going to be something like that in here.
I think many of these numbers on that, Mr. Wallace, good catch. I think
Yeah.
many of these numbers are too high.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we look at the new, we can go back all the way to the place where it's totaled. Okay, so the new position, it should be 2.4.
Okay.
So I think it was probably doubled.
Right.
on
So
that last-
it's right there. I just want to make
Yes.
sure that didn't carry through to the overall.
No, it didn't. It was just when I tried to prepare the list. I started out by showing the individual health insurance, individual dental insurance, the FICA separately, the IMRF separately, and then I thought, no, it's too many columns. So I tried to summarize it into.
Okay.
I combined salary, health, and dental, and FICA, IMRF together. But when I did that, I forgot to only count those two columns, and it ended up doubling it. So I apologize.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's this.
Are the totals correct though?
Well, not for
line?
these. Let me see if I could find the beginning. I'm sorry. So these are safety. Okay, so the first, it's this slide and this next slide. These two slides are incorrect. That total column on those two slides is incorrect. It should be half of that. Half of that. So I apologize. So that total column is incorrect. It's twice as much as it should be. But what's built into the budget is correct. It's just the presentation on these two slides is incorrect.
Joe, if you could keep, Madam Chair.
Yes, sir.
Todd, on some of these, and Chris, Kyles, thank you for bringing this up. Where you see above the subtotal general fund, the 3 for development, property code inspector.
Yeah.
Those are actually brand new positions that we're adding. So Todd, while you might look at those and say, wow, we're adding those and that's going to cause, $200,000 to be added in. We're actually hoping that there's an offset on the state's attorney's side because of adding this in. There'll be a reduction in workload on their side. And I don't know that this stuff always reflects it, but I'd be negligent if I didn't at least point that out. So just because we're adding somebody doesn't always mean it's just a net gain to that column. There might be a reduction. We just don't know how to put that into a computational model yet.
Shepro, comment? I had the impression from talking with the state's attorney that they thought that while those positions were necessary, it was not going to reduce their workload, but probably increase it because they would likely be generating more complaints.
That was not my impression at all, to be honest with you, Ken.
To be clear, we're talking about mental health clinicians.
No. Property
Oh,
code,
no, we're talking
property
about
code
the-
inspector,
Right.
I'm sorry, which one?
the property code inspectors.
Administrative
yes.
office.
Mark
code
Van
enforcement.
Kirchhoff and
Gotcha.
Jody had brought forward. And my impression, Ken, was it was absolutely opposite of that. That because they were going to be able to get in front of it, it would actually reduce the load from the state's attorney's office. And maybe
correct.
something's changed after that conversation, but
That's
that was
my
my
understanding.
conversation.
That is my understanding as well, because right now they're doing that work and this will be in front of it to correct any.
That doesn't make any sense to me. If you generate more activity on enforcement, that means you're going to get more cases brought by the state's attorney. So I guess we'll
Higher
find out.
paid, Ken Surgis, higher paid, higher level people are working on that now that don't need to be. And so if we bring a department on, if you will, or a group of people that are paid an appropriate fee, freeing up the state's attorney's time, it's actually, the projection is a net drop in cost.
And there is a position here, ASA code enforcement is a budgeted line as well. So they are requesting an additional attorney to hire the code inspector, the work of the code inspector and the off-code enforcement officers.
That's the goal.
Okay, to offset them? It looks like they're additional people.
To offset the work of the current staff. You're right, it is an additional person who will support the work of the code enforcement, the two admin and property code enforcement, new hires from.
Well,
Department of
there's
Development. So
There's also a code enforcement position in the civil division also, or I guess that's the only one that's earmarked for code enforcement.
So for development, there's 3 code inspectors as I'm reading this, and 1 from the civil ASA code enforcement. So total of 4 new positions for that.
And that's going to result in reducing the remaining cost to the state's attorney's office.
Although Ken Surgis, again, quite honestly, that ASA code enforcement line item there was not part of my discussions at the time. My discussions were on the development, the 3 being added from the development side. So
Right,
the state's
well,
attorney one wasn't there, but at the time with just those 3, the discussion was that it should be a reduction in cost overall. I just don't know how we would ever model to show that, but that's the goal.
Okay, well.
One of those, it'll be a true up afterwards and just see where we're at.
All right, any other questions for Mr. Onzik?
I just have this one last slide. And this is just to kind of recap what is here. So we've got 31 Safety Act positions added to the budget in total. We've got 27 new non-Safety Act positions added. We have included the union wage increases that for the unions that there's contracts were settled. There's a 3% non-union wage increase added. So the question is, do you wish to increase it to 4% as had been forecast or leave it at 3%? There's a $700,000 put in contingency for the first of 3 years of department equity adjustments. Is that okay to leave it there that way? Or would you prefer it be handled a different way or not have it in the budget at all? So these are like types of questions you should be thinking about. So of course, there's no property tax increase included other than the 500,000 for new construction. There's no new sales tax added. And also just keep in mind, there is no equity adjustment included for the state's attorney's office as of yet, should there be. No amount had been indicated as to what should even be considered. So I couldn't even tell you what the amount should possibly be to be considered. But that, I just want to make sure you know, it is not in this budget. And I know they've presented several times on their request that something be added. So just wanted to point out it's not in here. So that's all I
Madam
have.
Chair.
If you have any other questions.
If I may, I'd like to address the equity adjustments for the SAO. This is just a reference point that it looks like they're non-safety act positions that are being added, I would assume are at current market rate. And I don't have the chart in front of us, nor do you know what people who are doing something similar right now, who are employed by the state's attorney, are making. Are they making the same wage, or are they making less than? Giving a new hire, they're making, and if that's the case, or if they're making up to with experience, and this is a new hire, I don't know the qualifications for this. Is it 3 years previous experience, 5? I have no idea. Or is this right out of law school? You know, I don't know what the qualifications are for this position, so we can make sure that there's an apple to an apple increase. But I believe the board's sentiment and what has been expressed is that we cannot offer a new position a salary that is more than a similar position that we currently have. It has to be more than, or at least equal to.
Madam Chair, for those in the room, Serge is here, but I had asked Ms. Labrillo to stop down during the last series of slides. Just to confirm, we had, from Human Services, we had reached out to each of the county offices that were asking for new positions to be filled, to make sure that that came with full job descriptions, the whole 9 yards, so that we could evaluate those against other communities and other counties to be able to provide the board with information. I hate using the word equity, but for a comparison model, we've asked not just for a blank request for a person with a budget, but for a job description so that we can do the comparative analysis. And that is forthcoming.
Do we know when they're going to be able to provide that
Jamie just
information?
told me a minute ago that we have one of the offices, the circuit clerk's office, has turned that information in, and they are the only one at this time. But I think the request just went out maybe 2 weeks ago.
Yes,
Does that sound about right?
that sounds about right.
Yeah, so I would expect those to come in, and I'd be difficult to make any judgment until that was here. So,
Okay, so that line item basically is still very fluid.
absolutely, yes.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Mr. Iqbal.
just for the clarity, what is meant by equity rate? Is it adjustment to bring the salary to the new level or something else?
I'd be happy to. So Mo, we did a survey across the county to say, if these are all of our positions from both the county offices and the county departments, can we put a description of what that person does so that we can use that in a comparative analysis against other counties to see, are we paying well? Are we dramatically below? How, what adjustments need to be made? Because, we really did pay out quite a bit in retention type bonuses and stuff like that. And we want to make sure that we're adjusting where we need to. And I believe that model did come back and say, we do have a threshold of people that are dramatically below where they need to be, but we also had a threshold of people that were well paid and at the upper end of things. So we came up with a forecast, if you will, or a game plan saying, this is what we'd like to do in a 3-year period to get everybody up in the range, in the appropriate range compared to other counties. And Joe, I think in one of the slides you had presented a $700,000 figure, which was just for phase one, year one of a 3-year plan to get us there. So we're just trying to make sure that we're off, if we're offering somebody 30,000, but on the open market, they can get 50,000, we should be aware of that because it's really hard to keep those employees. On the other hand, if we're paying somebody more, we don't need to make an adjustment there. We're okay. But without having that data, pretty difficult to do that. And so for the new positions, that handles the equity with existing people, but the new positions, we want to have that as well. And they all kind of interact together. Joe, was I even close on that?
It sounds correct.
Okay.
Joe, the one thing that I don't see here is that with the additional new hires, potential new hires, as well as the new Safety Act positions, and I've mentioned this several times, where in the budget is an increase in our capital expenses to either do a build out or to rent a new facility, an office building, so that there is an adequate location for those individuals to work. Because again, it's my understanding that they're full. There is no additional, with the current space allocation we have right now, there is not the space for all these new hires to work appropriately.
Well, this presentation is for the general fund, so that would not be part of the general fund. So I did not focus on that, look at that. So I honestly don't even know. I would suspect if it is in the budget, it would be in the capital budget. If it's not in the capital budget, then that would be something that we would need to talk to Roger, I guess, and see about having that included in the budget. I had not seen their capital budget presentation.
So since we are just simply presenting revenue, can you explain how the money gets into the capital budget if we're in a deficit spending, potential deficit spending, without having that capital expense, which is going to happen?
That is not a question I can even answer, because where is the revenue going to come from? I have no idea. I mean, we need revenue to come in. I mean, this is the issue, that we're looking at this huge deficit for operating alone. There's some money set aside in the capital fund reserve, but we already know that is nowhere near sufficient to meet the capital needs. So that's an entirely separate issue, but just as important issue.
Okay. So just for bells and whistles and just gamesmanship, let's say $10 million. Just put it out there, $10 million, which may be low, but I'm not a builder. No, so I'm just using that as a potential placeholder to definitely, I think that's a comfortable number to use. I know we're looking at an opportunity to potentially relocate our files and storage into another facility, which may potentially free up other space, but there'll have to be a potential office space that could be used, which is right now used for storage. That cost for the move and finding that location is going to be one expense. The other is to do the build out so that those large spaces that would be utilized previously for boxes and whatnots are now accommodating workers, staff. So we're trying to be as very modest as we possibly can to use whatever available spaces we have, and choosing another location for things that are not the building that is less needy. If you can get my drift, I'm trying to be general as possible. Yes.
Madam Chair, sir, just so, as we begin identifying and as this Safety Act, if this comes to fruition and rolls out, and we identify what exactly the needs are, new and shiny is always so attractive and gets the attention, but in the past, we purchased that Montgomery Ward's building and turned it into the circuit clerk's office. And I think that there's other buildings around our area that can be
We're being
repurposed.
incredibly fiscally conservative.
Yep,
with
absolutely.
approaches.
I'm hoping that we're looking at any and all options. But again, we're not just talking about buildings, we're talking about desks and computers and chairs and telephones and the whole 9 yards. And I think we really need to understand what that need is and do it from a holistic approach on this. And I hope that my colleagues, aren't just about building a new tower, but if there's something that we can repurpose that makes sense in one of our communities, that we might look at that as well.
Absolutely. No, and that's exactly our approach right now. All right, so what do you need from us? And then how do we get to answer those questions as collectively as a 24 board members?
Well, we have about a month to finalize the budget. So it could be as simple as nobody doing anything and we just use the reserves to balance the budget and we're done. But if you would like any changes to be made in terms of if you think there's too many new people, take a look at those, possibly reduce some of them. Is there too much in Safety Act expense? Look at that, possibly recommend that something be removed. Are you okay with the 3% for non-union? So it's basically these same questions. So it would be however you would like to meet among yourselves and discuss it and come to a decision. These are the questions that need to be answered with this information in mind.
Bates, please.
Yes, Ms. Bates, if I may, and then I'm going to recognize you, just clarity. So right now, we have $29 million in reserves. And we're looking at drawing down, let's say 16 million of that for next year, which will leave us $13 million in remaining reserves. Now, I've just mentioned approximately $10 million in doing capital expenses, all baseline, which would give us $3 million left in our reserves if we have no other income coming in, all things equal.
You're not suggesting that we would buy a house and pay for it in full. We would finance that $10 million over.
Well, it depends on, we may not buy. I'm just using this as a number. And yes, some of it maybe have to spend down. Because we cannot go to bond, because we don't have the money to pay for the bond. Remember, that cannot happen according to Mr. Onsick until 29 or 30. So we're going to have to figure out how we're going to be paying for this. And I'm just using what we have right now. Whether we can pay it off in a period of time, that's fantastic. That'll lessen that. But even if we spend 5 million, then we have $8 million left in reserves. So then if we go back to following year, so now we're into 20. You had the projections for 24, didn't you? But not on the spreadsheet.
Well, I have it here displayed now.
So
I have the original projected shortfalls on the top line. And as you can see, we're already beyond what I was projecting for FY23 by almost 1.7 million. But the point of this slide, I think, maybe helps to make the point that the total forecasted deficit over these through 2000. Oh gosh, I made a mistake in that column heading. It should be the second from the end should be FY25. I apologize for that. So for FY23, 24, 25, and 22, the total forecasted deficit is $77 million, which means that if we do nothing to increase revenue, do nothing to cut expenses, we have to have $77 million in reserves to get us through that time. And if we're already talking about having only 3 million to end FY23, what are we going to do for FY24 and FY25? So that's, yes, we can spend everything now for capital and operating, but this is looming out there.
if we go, Ms. Bates, I'm sorry, because I can linger on this one for a while. Ms. Bates. your
Yeah,
question, please.
I have a pretty short question, I think. What was the aggregate of unions raises?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
What was the aggregate of the union raises? Because we were trying to, the question Mr. Anzick asked is 3% enough for non-union raises, or do we need 4%? And my question is, what was the aggregate for the union raises? Because he said we try to keep a balance with the non-union raises and the union raises.
I do not have an answer to that question. It would be a very difficult calculation to even come up with, because as I was trying to explain earlier, there are large equity adjustments included in the union increases. I mean, just one comes to mind. I mean, for court security alone, their budget was increased by 36% to cover their expense, to cover the increase position by position. So how does that compare to, I mean, how this is why it's so difficult, because yes, it's a large increase for them based on, from a percentage standpoint, but if you try to factor that in to how does that pertain to everyone else across the board, it becomes very difficult. So.
Okay, I'm sorry if I asked an impossible question.
I'm sorry, I wish I could answer it.
I'm just trying to figure out if 3% is enough.
Yes, Mr. Martin.
I apologize, but I have to leave in a minute. I have a fundamental block here.
John, once again.
I have a fundamental block in my mind. And that in 22, we will end up with a balanced budget, a balanced set of books by the end of the year, because we are collecting more money than we anticipated. And so we in fact are balanced. At the end of the year, we're not going to be using any reserves. In 2023, taking all that into consideration, we need $15 million instead of $13 million. Why are we not talking about a $2 million deal here? What do I miss?
Well, okay. That, I guess if we, I don't want to make this more difficult than it needs to be. Let's see. I can go back to the close to the beginning. Oops, there we go. Okay. Do you see in the revenue line where it says other changes?
Yeah.
There's almost $15 million increase there. So we are increasing, and if you start with that first column, the FY22 budget, and you go across, so you're starting with FY22 and then you go across, and those are all the changes taking place on the revenue line to get to the final number of 106. So we are increasing revenue by, what is that? Let me see, maybe there's a better slide.
No, I
14.8. Yeah.
Okay. So this, maybe this will help. So if you just look at FY22 compared to FY23, we're increasing revenue by almost 13.8 million.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if you look at expenses, we're increasing expenses by 16.4 million.
Yeah, so that's like $3 million.
I just, okay. So the increase in the deficit, oh shoot, I can't, this is too hard to be clicking
Yeah, you don't have
around.
to do this on the cuff, but
It's 2.6 million.
Appropriate question, though. I agree.
Yeah, all right, so are we not talking about a $2.6 million problem for next year?
No, it's higher. Yeah. The only reason it would be higher, if I can interrupt, is because the potential new hires of the Safety Act, as well, the personnel costs. That's where it's.
But Joe's budget for 23 includes all that Safety Act stuff and all the new employees. Does it not?
Yes.
It does. So if you were, I'm sorry, this is not going to work. If we were to look at the amended budget, the FY 22 budget, right now it's showing that there's a deficit, the budget showing that there's a deficit 13 million. So if you add, let's say 13 million to the revenue, now there's no deficit. So we're going from a zero deficit to a $15.7 million deficit. So the change would actually be 15.7 million instead of the 2.6 million. So like because what you're saying is the bottom line for FY 22 is going to be zero. We'll have a balanced budget and not have to use reserves. So if you make that bottom line zero, but we're forecasting a $15.7 million deficit, then the change from FY 22 to FY 23 is going to be the $15.7 million deficit.
Okay.
So
All right.
Got it.
I apologize. I have to leave.
sorry that
Yeah, I think what John is asking is, Joe, on that screen there where it says 2023 budget at the bottom,
yeah,
it's showing a $15.7 million deficit,
yes.
but that doesn't jive with the math from the first screen that says there's only a 2-point-something million dollar
Well,
deficit.
I think
Is
I
that
understand what you're
fundamentally-
saying.
Which screen? You're saying there's a previous screen of 2.6? It's the difference between FY 22 and FY 23 that's 2.6. The budgeted difference.
No, I think we were looking at least I was looking at revenue versus expenditure.
So back to the,
Madam Chair, that's a sideways difference, not a, that's just comparing year to year.
all right, so are you talking about this slide or maybe is this slide easier?
That slide, that slide.
This one?
Mhm.
It's still a $16 million deficit. It's just $2 million more than the year before.
Or additional 16 million, little more than 2.5 million, if we add the 4%. Yes. Mr.
Yes.
Paul.
Joe, what Mr. Martin was saying, that those two numbers are not the same. Here you have a 92 versus 106. And the other sheet had 113 and 116, something like that. So these are not the numbers. I mean, here you get a difference of roughly 14 million. The other one was giving a difference of roughly 2 to 3 million. So those are not exactly the same numbers we are subtracting.
What page, please?
We don't know.
I think, so what happened is that, in my understanding, Joe, please correct me, is that we were facing a budget deficit for this year. We were able to make it because we had additional sales tax revenue coming in due to the taxing on the purchases made by computer. Online purchases were coming in. So we received those. Those were able to back up our reserves, which were going to be used. So they replenished themselves. So, but we forecasted 13 million in deficit using reserves to pay for that. Now we have, that was added the $29 million in reserves back to our reserves because it's been replenished. We're made whole with that. So now we're in 23 budget and we have additional new employees, et cetera, and commodities have gone up. So now the forecast says we're once again going back down into deficit of 15.75 million. So we still have the 29 million. So we can take the 29 million as we did last year and put that in. But Joe now has taken, because we have a number to work with, projected number of additional sales tax that we didn't have last year. You've put that into this budget, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
So that budget now is more accurate than it was in 22 because that money just came and it was like, holy cow, people spent a lot of money sitting at home. So now we've got a number we're working with. And with that number in tow, we're still $15.75 million worth of deficit.
Madam Chair, Surges again. I understand looking just at this slide, I get it. Not having the slide beforehand, which no big deal. I mean, I get, you probably worked through the night just to get to this, but Mo, I agree with you. Slide to slide, I'm not tracking. I'm, you know, where I show 15 million here, on the other slide, I didn't track with that same 15. So I don't know how to advance slides to look at that.
Oh, okay, this difference, so we're starting with the if we look at the deficit on this slide, it's 15.772. Okay, on this slide, it's 15.772 off to the right side. Okay, then this is just total revenue, total expenses, total revenue, total expenses, total revenue again, total expenses, and now this, you see the middle column, it's still 15.772
There it
deficit.
is.
And then these are just details with an incorrect total column. And then there you have the budgeted shortfall of 15.772 again, compared to what was originally projected of 14.1. There's that 15.772 proposed use of the reserves to balance the budget. So I mean, maybe if you find what it is you're not thinking matches, please let me know, because maybe I'm just not seeing it.
So
Mr. Surges, does that satisfy you that the number is correct?
Yeah, I think I'm looking at so many screens that I may be looking at differences of year over year at 2.6 million, and I'm not debating that the 15.772.149 is being pulled from screen to screen to screen. Again, I'm being asked to look at this in, you know, an hour and 24 minutes here to try and regurgitate all this. But I'm fundamentally solid. You know, Mavis, I look at this and say, you know, our job is to come up with a way to address that shortfall. And it's so easy to say, take it from reserves, but I mean, it would be just as easy to say, we're not going to make the equity raises. We're going to have to ask offices and department heads to come up with a reduction in their budgets. We have to look at everything possible to bring that forward for us to be able to make a decision. And this is just one component going forward. And Joe, I think you've done a great job of trying to outthink our questions by saying, this is what came in extra that we didn't count on last year, but I've built that in for going to next year. And I think the thing I most applaud is, at our last meeting, you introduced a concept that I wasn't familiar with, but the structural budget, saying, while this is where you're at, you're kind of trending that structurally, if everything goes in place the way it's supposed to, y'all are in trouble in about 3 years. You know, you might be able to make it through this year and we might be able to make some adjustments, but if everything goes as calculated structurally, you have a problem. And whether that's looking at the 440 million cash reserve, or that's looking at emergency reserves, or that's working at whatever it is, that structural doesn't seem to lie. It's pretty straightforward. And I think that's, if people say, keep your eye on the ball, I think that's the ball we're supposed to be watching. And I'll be really curious to see over the next 6 months, 8 months, how some of this unfunded legislation actually, I'm hoping, changes or morphs, or, you know, is reduced, or we find some other way to help cope with this, if not for our county, but for a bunch of counties. You know, and I appreciate all the work, and you know, I don't know how you sleep at night, but thank you.
I didn't.
I mean, thank you. Yes.
I just, something I wanted to point out, since you mentioned it, is back to that beginning slide, or almost beginning slide, is, okay, just notice that of the $15.7 million deficit, only 3.4 million of it has to do with the Safety Act. So even if the Safety Act goes away, we still have a $12 million deficit.
Right. I'll print this evening because it's not just the Safety Act, but it's the equity raises. It's,
Well,
I mean, it's
right.
all of it kind of compounds.
But
And-
I'm
and
just,
Thank you.
yes, pointing out that maybe we're lulled into thinking it's all about the Safety Act when we have a much bigger problem than that.
One more question, please, Madam Chair.
If you can hold on, Mr. Kaios has his hand up. He has not yet spoken.
Because everybody said everything. It's very good, very good discussion. Essentially, if we took and held everything exactly the same, our $105 million expenditure from this year to next year, not raise a damn thing, we'd be able to cover our budget. That's what it boils down to. So everything else is,
However, that's,
how you do that, that's the rub, but
we have commodities that are.
1
going
year
up.
behind somewhere in revenue.
We have uncontrolled commodity increases that we have, and energy that we have we can negotiate, but
Well, those are small compared to a lot of the other things, though.
but significant still. And we also have an increased cost in healthcare, which we cannot address for this year. We may be able to address the following year. And that's another increased cost. So there's a lot of devils nipping at this very fragile budget. And they're not devils, they're just they're little gremlins.
I think you had Bates waiting.
No, I figured it out. Thanks.
Thank you.
So,
Madam Chair?
Vern Cheppy has his hand up.
oh, yes, Mr. Tepe, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've been listening here for quite some time and absorbing this. Mr. Onsek, thank you very much for these slides. And would you go to the second last slide on your list, please? The last one says questions.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay, right there. All right. First off, with all of this, we've got a $15.8 million budget deficit. All right. Comment I want to make is that first line may say the expense of the 31 Safety Act personnel may only be $3 or $4 million, but the impact of that in 24 and 25 is quite substantial. Okay. So we cannot count that out. Right. The expense of the 27 new act personnel, I think that needs to be looked at. I definitely think we're going to be faced with having to deal with personnel increases on a regular basis anyway. But I think we need to, people calling it the wrong time, my apologies. I think we definitely need to look at a list of things that we either want to cut out or some ways that we can add more income. I don't see any ways to immediately add more income, and I certainly do not want to balance this budget by taking the money out of reserves. And we also have to look at the impact that this is going to have on space. If we add this many people, we have no room to put them. So we've got to do some tough things, and I'd like to see us all kind of make a list and get them to Madam Chair to take a look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tepe. Yes, any suggestions that you have, creative suggestions on how to fine tune this and bring this budget in line are welcomed. I do believe that we will have to reach out to each one of our department heads as your committee to ask them to reevaluate their need for the 27 new employees. I think that'll be prudent to do. There may be a want, there may be a need, and obviously needs are important. Wants perhaps can be deferred to a following year, or there may be another creative approach on how to fund that. We are looking at reviewing the cost of healthcare. And that'll be coming up through Mr. Sturgis's soon. That's a very difficult, challenging thing from what my understanding is. So that may not even be presented till next year because of its complexity, but to see how we can bring down those costs appropriately, because that does impact our employees. Their bottom line, it truly does. So we want to make sure that we are cost effective with that as possible, along with saving the counties some significant money on that. Capital expenses, building, et cetera, we've already addressed. The more employees we have to find space for them. And I know there is conversation about having people work virtually. That perhaps you may also want to go ahead and ask all of your department heads how many people can work safely from home. Can they appropriately do that? But best practices do show that you want to have that kind of blended opportunity where people not only work virtually, but also have the opportunity to work in office as well, to develop a esprit de corps, a sense of camaraderie, being able to just get to know the people that you're working with.
Madam Chair, Sturgis, for the sake of time, since we're looking at, Joe said 30 days to get this budget passed. Maybe 3 or 4 months ago, it would be appropriate to begin some conversations within our departments. Is it and again, I don't have an answer for this. This is a question. Is it appropriate for you at a staff level to bring this to the departments and say, hey, we need the plan Bs coming forward? Because I don't know, waiting through a committee rotation schedule over a month, that will get that. We may need a special, I don't know, is there ever a department meeting or something, or office meeting to say, this is where we're at on the budget. And if the goal is to not gamble on a reserve, then we're looking at $15 million that we need to reach out and ask people. We need all available options on the table. And I don't know that maybe that is a special meeting, not for the 24 commissioners, but for the department heads to say, this is where we're at.
I'd be happy to do that. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And again, happy to stand at your side. I'm not trying to dump work on your
No,
desk.
but these are things we have to be creative in managing this. Yes, sir.
I agree with Mr. Sturgis. And I think that if there's any investment we make right now, it's a bunch of red pens. Because I think that in my mind, it goes without saying that the last thing that we should be doing is adding new non-required personnel at this point. And I think department heads right now have a responsibility to take a look at the efficiencies within their departments or lack thereof, and really focus on what can be done about it. I mean, I think that we're going to have to end up drawing down at least some amount to cover this, but I think adding more bloat is only kicking the can down the road. We really need to focus on where we're being inefficient. And, I hope that there's a little more sanity in Springfield about some of the things that are coming out of there and the lack of funding for these requirements that are being laid on our lap. But, that's beyond our control. The only thing that we can control is what's happening within our departments. And I think that there should be a focus on our department heads figuring out what is necessary and what can be cut.
We can ask our department heads to do that. The elected officials, however, we have no authority over. We have an authority over their total budget, but we have no authority over how they spend that money. That is their job to do so. So that may be a suggestion. We can ask our or other elected officials to review as well, because with this, we are all in. I mean, this is something we're all in. The other thing I would like you all to consider, and we have talked about this before, we have been zero-based property tax increase, CPI, for approximately 10 years. I would like you to consider is this the time to start making potential changes to that? Right now, we can raise it up to 5%, which would bring in, I think, $2.5 million. Is that correct?
That's roughly it, yes.
Or it can be less. 3.5% if you want to be a little bit more moderate. That is a long-term goal to be able to start building up enough revenue to be able to future balance this. But if you collectively as a board decide that that is not an option you would like to pursue, then I will bow down to Mr. Wallace's suggestion that if everything is going to be the same and we're relying on an increase of sales tax, which I think is pretty robust right now. I don't see it increasing dramatically. People have bought enough shirts and ties and leisure suits, whatever they're going to be buying for a while. People are back to work. Then given that budget to be flat, we have to dramatically decrease the county, which means decreasing in appropriate services. I think the red pencils are a good analogy. That would we would be purchasing. So what do you cut?
Madam
What
Chair.
services do we cut?
Thank
So those are thought, and we need to, excuse me, I'll be done in just a minute, Ms. Bates. We have to get those thoughts out regarding tax levy, property tax levy, collectively to Joe so he can start making appropriate accommodations in this budget. If you went to 5, the deficit would be reduced by 2.5 million approximately. It's still a huge deficit, so it's going to have to be a combination of both. Yes, Ms. Bates.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is such an interesting conversation, and I appreciate everybody's input and thoughtfulness about this. I have a feeling, I have a hunch here that in 30 days, it's going to be very difficult to do any of these changes. To ask our department heads to figure this out in 30 days or to raise taxes in 30 days, it can't be done, I believe. So Mr. Tepe said we should not take it out from reserves. I agree, but I believe that's what we're going to have to do. I seriously think that taking that this year, we have to take out of reserves. Next year, let's start today to make sure we don't have to take out of reserves for the next coming years. But I think that's what we have to do for this year.
Be done.
Thank you.
Mr. Wallace.
If I could just respond on one point, I agree with what Ms. Bates said. I think that one of the dangers of hiring 27 new employees is that we're now signing ourselves up for additional expenditures. And if we're talking about, okay, we're going to take care of this next year, well, now we just put 27 more people on the payroll. And so that makes it a lot more difficult to address the problem in future years if we're doing that.
I agree. No, I agree. Yes, sir.
Chair Bates.
Kenyon,
Hold on.
before we can do anything, we need to fill the room with people so we can have an active debate. People talk back and forth. There's just a few of us here. And we're only almost just a half of the board attending. So we need people to be, board members to be interested in what we're doing or trying to do. So,
I agree.
Good luck with that.
This is
I agree.
yeah, we all agree with that. So, all right, I think we've had a lot to think about, and just so I have my to-do list, is I will send out a email, or actually I'll have Jane send out an email to our department heads, asking them to review their requests for new hires, as well as to consider if any of their current hires can be work remotely or have shared offices. So sometimes they're in, sometimes they're not, to see if that would be appropriate. We will ask the same thing of all of our elected officials as a request, obviously not as a suggestion, just as a
Right.
potential request, if they could possibly do the same thing. So that's my to-do list. I will also then will reschedule another committee meeting to be able to discuss those results. I think we need to give it a couple of weeks though for our department heads to review and see what they're, to bring down a new proposal to us. At that point, we'll make sure that we get a convenient time for board members to attend. We'll send out the meeting as quickly as possible, and it'll be another committee of the whole discussion. So we can just have a robust discussions without decisions being made. And then Mr. Onsick then can put his magic numbers together.
May I squeeze in one more comment, Madam Chair?
Oh, sure. Ms. Bates,
Thank you.
absolutely.
I agree that we have to be lean and mean, but I also see that our department heads have never given us any bloat. I don't think we are. I think they are efficient. I think it's going to be very hard for them. I don't think they would be requesting these positions if they weren't absolutely necessary. So, but we can always ask, as Mr. Wallace is suggesting.
Very good.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Berman.
Berman here. It's one thing to ask the department heads to look at it. I think we, each one of us needs to look at each department and say, we've got all information. We should be able to ask some intelligent questions of those department heads as to whether what they're looking for is really important to them. So I think that's one of the things that we have some homework to do ourselves, rather than bounce it off Joe's or ask them to come back with their evaluation. I think their evaluation is what they gave us in their request. That's what they feel they need. And I think that's what we asked them to do. And so I think we need to develop some intelligent questions of them as to what they really feel is necessary. My comment.
Madam Chairman, Allen,
Oh, yes, Miss Allen.
I wanted just to follow up on Mr. Berman. For the department requests, those have all gone through committee. In the development department, Mr. Van Kerkhoff said, we've always been behind on problem properties. We're proposing adding 3 people to our staff so we get ahead of problem properties. And what happens is that rather than go to court or have to deal with the legal system, people will usually comply. So you put your money into these 3 positions. You now start to badger the people with problem properties. You get them to take care of their properties. They pay their fines. They get themselves even with the building codes that are in place. And you've just made a good use of 3 new staff people in improving the county and taking that burden off the state's attorney's office when you have to go and sue them because they haven't done what they're supposed to do. That may not be the best synopsis of what happened in the development committee, but it's an explanation of how those 3 positions came to be talked about and approved by that committee. Building management has a huge change here. Building management has been struggling the whole 20 years that I've been with the county. And this is the first time, thanks to Mr. Fonstock working with his people in building management, that there is a plan to actually deal with the problems of maintaining all of these buildings and being able to have enough money to hire staff. Building maintenance has had empty positions forever because we don't offer enough to pull people into our purview to help take care of our buildings. That also went through committee. And maybe you can say, well, let's start with 2 maintenance people in each division instead of 3 maintenance people and see if we really need 3 maintenance people. But this rebuilding of building maintenance has been coming on for a long time. And finally, we came up with a plan. So this is just a couple of instances where, yeah, let's go back and review these things, but there were good reasons for these decisions being made. Now, I'm also going to stick my foot in it and say, with the Safety Act, our concern is that we hire 30 people now. We don't know where we're going to house them. And the question is, in 2 years, will we still need those 30 people? Or will some of those positions be handled by positions that already exist and just changing their scope of work? So that's something we just don't know how. We need a really good crystal ball here. Thanks for letting me talk.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well said.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to, and this
Yes,
is
Mr.
sticking in my
Pius.
craw. I don't mind having a discussion on whether we should be spending money on personnel or expending to take care of maintenance and things like that. And I admire I thank you, Ms. Allen, for pointing that out in your discussion just previous to mine here. But I would shy away from using the words bloat, because if you have worked with the departments, as I have, and I think Mr. Surgis has, and anyone has here at this institution, you will have seen that we have cut this to the bone over the last 4 years I've been here, and we cut it before then even. And to characterize what we are doing and what our employees are doing and our managers are doing as bloat or excessive, I think distorts what we are trying to accomplish here. And for me, it's, I think, a bit offensive after having worked with these individuals for the last 4 years to say that they are trying to take advantage of the aegis of the taxpayers, because we run a very tight ship. I think that there was a study done about 8 years ago that showed that they in fact said that we had already cut everything to the bone, and we have still kept that without any increases in taxes since that time in the mandated services.
2017.
I admire, I applaud everyone that works for the county. I think they do a great job, and I think our managers are doing a great job. And I want to find out, as we do and go through this discussion in a reasonable manner, a way to accomplish what this county needs as we grow, because we are now growing, and it's important that we provide services to our constituents without using hyperboles that inflame and or distort possibly the character of the individuals that are trying to accomplish things here. So thank you.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Surges. Chris, if I can, I personally have never used the words bloat. Yeah, I understand.
No, and I didn't refer to you. It's
Okay, no, I appreciate
because
it.
I know
do-
you've worked with
I
individuals.
appreciate that,
You
but
got-
I would say that there's been several instances where we've looked at a restructuring, and at least in human services, we actually introduced software that electronic management system just never existed. And the leap of faith to say, let's implement that to see what it does. We're fully staffed and showing a reduction for next budget cycle. And sometimes those leap of faiths and that restructuring and you know what, I don't think any of us like that Roger's budget is huge, but by God, not Roger's budget for the building department, but by golly, we asked him to restructure that thing from head to toe. And it is what it is. And we need to look at that and say, if that's the plan, then let's work the plan and see where it goes. Deb had mentioned, and again, we mentioned that earlier today. I honestly believe, we need to spend a buck to make a buck in this situation. If putting on 3 code enforcement officers actually winds up with a net negative to the budget, then we should do that. And if we need to dip into reserves to make that initial investment to see where it goes, I think it will actually prove positive in the long run by reducing a budget. And bloat's not the word, but let's look at some of those structural components that might get us into a better direction. So thank you.
Agreed on the verbiage. Yeah.
All right. So
The idea.
I think Mr. Wallace, I know will agree that we have great staff here. I think everybody would agree with that. And it's getting continually better, more efficient with the software that is being used, as well as good management, putting the right people in the right place really makes for effective management all along. I think we also can agree that our staff who have worked here some very long, oftentimes have not been paid what other counties or municipalities could pay them. But they've been loyal and they've continued to work hard. And that is something we have to respect and honor all of that. So there's truth in all of that. My concern still is that deficit, and knowing that with the presentation that was done previously about the fund balances that we have, the 440 approximate $1 million, that all except 29 million of that right now seems to be restrictive, used for other sources, other needs, that we have $29 million now to divvy out to a growing deficit. And that's what keeps me up at night. So even if we were to take a 5% reduction, hypothetically, please, hypothetically, a 5% reduction in staff, we still couldn't manage the deficit because we still have a growing deficit. So that we can talk about efficiencies, we can talk about this, that, and the other thing. It was addressed, I believe, 10 years ago, was it, or 12 years ago, that the health department was cut from 150 people to 75 people. Services were privatized. So they were sent out to other organizations, and privatized, this case was be to other not-for-profit organizations, where they picked it up and they reduced the amount of people here working for the health department. Other organizations picked up that weight and provided services. So are there things that we can privatize and spin off? I cannot answer that. What do we, roads? I mean, do we privatize building maintenance? Do we sell our buildings and lease it back? I'm being, how should, these are complex questions, but we still have a deficit that we have to take a look at. And if we continue to consider revenue sources and say we can't do these things because it will impact our taxpayers, and oftentimes taxpayers feel they don't have a trust of government, that we're not doing the right thing, then who can provide those services? So that's a question to consider as we start talking about this sensitive balance of what our government, our county should be doing. Yes, sir, Mr. Wallace.
I apologize for my use of the term bloat. I didn't mean it in that manner. It was a poor choice of words. I guess, I mean, I would say, and I agree with everything that has been said in the quality and caliber of our current existing staff. I guess I'm trying to express my frustration with what is being imposed upon us, and having to increase staff prospectively in such an uncertain manner. So just trying to find a way to deal with that in a budget, in the budget scenario is difficult. So.
Agreed. I think that's part of the problem, is it is a very frustrating where we're stuck right now.
Mm-hmm.
So
Thank you, Mr. Wallace.
I apologize for responding that way as well.
Madam Chair.
This is an honest
Mr.
conversation.
Iqbal has reminded me that time is slipping away and we need to adjourn so these young ladies can go home and enjoy their families. And you can take Biscuit out for a walk. I move we adjourn.
A little nugget will appreciate that.
Second, Bates second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Great conversation, everybody, and
Yes.
honest.
Thank you,
Well done
everybody.
today. Well done.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You kept this going.